This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome again to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 367 entitled Jesus' Sonship in Matthew, Part 1. Now, I've been alerted by my listeners that we are in the midst of Season 8 in this podcast, as I've been doing this podcast now going into the 8th year every single week without having missed a week. So if you've been here since the beginning, since 2018, I appreciate your support. But this week, as we talked about, we're going to look at the subject of sonship in the Gospel of Matthew. And there's quite a lot on this particular subject, so this is going to at least go for 2 weeks, maybe possibly 3 weeks. We'll see how things work out. Now, we can see in the Gospel of Matthew, of course, that Jesus is described as the Son of God. And as the Son of God, Jesus naturally has a very interesting relationship with the true God. But we also see that Jesus will describe his own disciples as sons of God. And there's some sort of relationship between Jesus and his disciples, because we can see in the Lord's Prayer that when Jesus teaches them how to pray, he says, "Our Father," meaning the Father belonging to Jesus and to his disciples. So what is it about Son of God that links Jesus with the disciples, and how did Matthew want his readers to understand the way in which they were supposed to read his gospel and see themselves as children of God as it relates to Jesus, who is the royal and messianic Son of God? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is looking at Jesus' sonship in the temptation narrative. Those of you who are familiar with the temptation narrative in Matthew chapter 4, and of course in its parallel in Luke chapter 4, you can see that the tempter, Satan, approaches Jesus and asks him repeatedly, "If you are the Son of God, do X, Y, and Z." So we're going to focus on the first particular temptation, because I think the way in which Jesus responds really helps us to understand how he viewed himself as the Son of God. And the passage that he quotes, I think, is very enlightening on this particular subject. So let's begin by reading Matthew chapter 4. We're just going to read the first 4 verses, where it says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread.' But he answered, 'It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God.'" That's Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Now, this particular episode comes immediately after Jesus was baptized. And the baptism of Jesus is crucially important in not just Matthew, but in all 4 of the Gospels, because that is the time in which the voice from heaven announces that this is my son. And of course, if the voice is saying that this is my son, then the voice, of course, is the Father alone, because the male person that has a son, of course, is the Father. And so we could see in these accounts of the baptism that Jesus is, of course, baptized in water, and this serves as the public anointing ceremony in which Jesus, the Christ, is actually coronated. It's his coronation ceremony for him to publicly be acknowledged as Israel's king, as the Son of God. So at the baptism, Jesus is publicly being installed as the royal Son of God. And how do we know this? Well, because the voice from heaven announces, with no greater authority than the Father himself, that Jesus is, of course, the Son of God, meaning he is Israel's anointed king. Now, the title Son of God, as I constantly have to remind people, is a title in the Old Testament that refers to a lot of persons, but for the purposes of this study, and I think for the purpose of the Gospel of Matthew, Son of God is applied to the nation of Israel and it's also applied to the human Israelite king. And this is very important because the king of Israel is, of course, the single person who functions as the royal representative of the entire nation. So, of course, you know that David, when he went out to fight Goliath, he was the one person that represented all of the Israelites. And, of course, when David sinned, his sin affected all the Israelites because it's clear in Jewish messianic understanding that the king is the one person who represents all of his people. And that Jewish understanding was carried over into the New Testament. This is how Paul, this kind of as a side note, Paul can say that people are in Christ because they are in the sphere of the one person of Christ, the king, that represents all of his people. So just kind of as a reminder of the way that Son of God is used in the Old Testament. Again, we're seeing Son of God being used for the nation of Israel, and Son of God also being used for Israel's representative, the king, the human Israelite king. So in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 through 23, it says, "Then you shall say to Pharaoh, Thus says Yahweh, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me." That's Exodus 4, verses 22 through 23. So God here says that Israel, the nation, is my son. So, of course, Son of God is a title referring to the entire nation of Israelites. And this gets repeated in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, which is looking back on the Exodus episode. And so Hosea says that when Israel was a child, I loved him. This, of course, is Yahweh speaking through the prophet Hosea. I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That's Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. So we have two big passages in the Hebrew Bible that indicate that the nation of Israel is described as Son of God. Now, what's interesting, especially with this Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 quote, is that Matthew has already alerted his readers to the fact that Jesus, the messianic individual who represents the entire nation, is actually being described as the Son of God with a citation of Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 that's used in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. So if Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 originally referred to Son of God as a title for the entire nation of Israel, Matthew's going to use that as a quote to refer to Jesus. Not that Jesus is the entire nation of Israel, but as the Messiah, as the Christ, as the king who represents his people, Matthew, of course, can draw on a Son of God passage representing Israel and use it for the royal, messianic, kingly Son of God, namely Jesus. So that passage, of course, is Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. Now, what about the Israelite king? That, of course, shows up in Psalm 2, verse 7. Remember the previous verse in Psalm 2, 6, where God is going to install his king, and the very next verse, Psalm 2, 7, where it says that I will surely tell of the decree of Yahweh. He said to me, you are my son, today I have become your father. So when Yahweh says to the king that you are my son, today I have become your father in Psalm 2:7, this immediately follows Psalm 2:6 to where Yahweh is installing his king. So when Yahweh installs his king, that king is anointed, and that king receives the title Son of God. This is why Jesus at his baptism, of course, is being anointed, and he's publicly declared for the office of Son of God, meaning he is the Israelite king. And then, of course, this language gets used in the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The particular verse of import is 2 Samuel 7, verse 14, where Yahweh, speaking to the prophet Nathan, says about the coming king that I will be his father and he will be a son to me. So God, of course, the I there, indicating Yahweh being only one person, because I is first person singular. He is the Father alone, and the Son, of course, is the Son of God, the Israelite king. So, as we've seen there, in Jewish messianic understanding, the Israelite king is called Son of God, and the nation of Israel is called Son of God. And Matthew already, prior to the baptism in Matthew chapter 3, and prior to the temptation narrative in Matthew chapter 4, Matthew's already alerted us that Jesus is going to be a king, a Son of God, that is going to represent the entire nation of Israel by quoting Hosea chapter 11, verse 1 and Matthew 2:15. Hopefully you're still with me here. So there is a connection between Son of God as a reference to the children of Israel and Son of God as a reference to Israel's royal representative, the anointed king, the Christ, the Messiah. And again, Matthew's already alerted us to this with his citation from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. So again, back to Matthew chapter 4, because that was kind of a big prologue to Matthew chapter 4, where we see the devil is tempting Jesus, as we saw, as we read. And the temptation is, hey, Jesus, why don't you turn some of these rocks into bread? Aren't you hungry? You have been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. You're hungry. Why don't you turn some stones into bread? And what Jesus does here is he actually responds with a quotation. Yes, he quotes the Bible. Yes, he quotes the Hebrew Bible. He says it's written, but his quotation is from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. And this particular quotation, because Jesus is actually just quoting part of it, if you go back and read the entirety of this verse, this is what it says. He humbled you, this is Yahweh humbled Israel, and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh. So it's Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, where Jesus is citing and using it as a way to respond to the temptation. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3 in the Hebrew, you can see that the references are actually second person singular. The you there is not second person plural, as in all of the Israelites. It's just to you, as in the nation there. And so when it says that he humbled you, that you there is second person singular. He let you be hungry, second person singular. He will make you understand, second person singular. And of course, it indicates that the nation can be described as a representative individual. However, it's very clear that the Israelites are human beings. They're men and women. And so in this passage in Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, it actually says that man will not live by bread alone, but man is going to live by every word that comes out of the mouth of Yahweh. And the Hebrew word for man here is actually with the definite article. We have ha-adam, and it appears twice. So a human being can't just live by bread by itself. Human beings also have to live by the things that are spoken through the mouth of God, meaning human beings are going to live their life by faithfully obeying what God says, not just by sustaining bread and having some water. The Septuagint, of course, continues to maintain the fact that this man, ha-adam, is a human being, using the Greek noun anthropos. And of course, when Matthew, who is writing in Greek, is going to draw on this passage, he also is going to use anthropos as well. What's fascinating about this passage is that Jesus quotes a verse. Don't miss this. Jesus is quoting a verse that describes a human being who is obediently relying on obeying every word that comes out of the mouth of Yahweh. So Jesus sees himself as a man, a member of the human race, a human being, as someone who is obeying and being faithful to everything that Yahweh actually speaks. So Jesus doesn't think that he's Yahweh. He thinks he's a human being who is being faithful and obedient to Yahweh, and this is how Jesus is an obedient son. Notice the temptation. If you are the Son of God, and the response to the temptation is that Jesus is replying that I am a human being who is being faithful to the Father. Yes, I am the Son of God, and I'm responding in a way that demonstrates that I'm an obedient son. I'm a loyal son. I'm being faithful as a son. So the sonship aspect of Jesus implies obedience to Yahweh precisely in his role as a human being. Now, let's go back and read the big section, the context of Deuteronomy chapter 8, because there's a lot more in there that I think Matthew is assuming that his readers are going to be aware of, because he is portraying Jesus in a way that is meant to give a parallel experience with the Israelites and their experience formerly in the wilderness. So we read Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, but let's read verses 1 through 6 to kind of get us this context here. So this is what it says. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that Yahweh swore to give to your fathers. This, of course, is Moses talking to this generation of Israelites. The passage goes on. And you shall remember the whole way that Yahweh your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. Let's remember that, 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, Yahweh your God disciplines you. That's a key point. As a human being is going to discipline his son, Yahweh is going to discipline you. So, verse 6, you shall keep the commandments of Yahweh your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. That's Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. And so there's some interesting things there. We can see several things that are very familiar to us based on what we just read in Matthew chapter 4. We have the theme of 40. We have the wilderness. We have the aspect of the temptation. We have the feeding of the food. But particularly, we have the idea of sonship. We have the temptation that's given in a way that makes Yahweh a father figure that is testing his children. And the children are described as a son. They're likened to a father that disciplines his son. This, of course, is Yahweh your God disciplining you, meaning that the children of Israel, they are sons of God, and Yahweh, of course, is the Father alone. There's no triune God here. As a man disciplines his son, that man, of course, is the son's father. Yahweh your God functions as the Father there as well. So, what are the parallels that we actually see here? And what do I think Matthew is expecting his readers to see with Jesus quoting Deuteronomy 8 and actually drawing comparisons with what is actually taking place here in the temptation narrative of Matthew chapter 4? Well, we've seen that Israel, the Son of God, was, of course, walking in the wilderness. What do we see with Jesus? Well, Jesus, the newly anointed Son of God, is also in the wilderness, okay? The next parallel is that Israel was tempted for a period of 40 years. So it's no surprise that Jesus was also tested for a period, not of 40 years, but of 40 days. I don't think it's an accident that it's 40 days. You know, the temptation didn't happen at 39 or 41 or 60 or 7 or 12. It's the 40 that is making that connection there. We also see the parallel that Israel's temptation was set in a context involving hunger. It involved food. It involved the fact that they were getting hungry. And guess what? Jesus' temptation is also in a context involving hunger. The temptation is to turn these rocks into some bread. The next parallel is that Israel's temptation was given in order to see if they would obey. It was a particular temptation to see if they would be faithful and loyal. And of course, we see Jesus' temptation is also to see if he's going to be obedient to Yahweh. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 8, that Yahweh is considered the God of Israel. And then, of course, in Matthew, the God of Jesus is, of course, going to be Yahweh himself. Nobody's thinking that Jesus is Yahweh. Jesus is the Son of Yahweh, because Yahweh is the Father alone. So Jesus is effectively reliving the temptations of his Israelite ancestors. And in doing so, he is doing it precisely as a human being, a man, a member of the human race, particularly as a man who is obediently relying on every single word that comes out of the mouth of Yahweh. Now, you could say that Israel in the past, in their own wilderness experience, did not faithfully obey everything that Yahweh said as Son of God, but Jesus demonstrates his ability and the right that he actually has to bear the title Son of God as Israel's representative, because he is able to be faithful and obedient and go through the same temptation that Israel obviously failed at doing. And in doing so, Jesus cites a passage from Deuteronomy 8 in order to prove that he is being obedient to this. Okay, so let's move to our second point, point number 2, which is sonship taught in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so having already established the fact that Jesus is Son of God as the Christ, as the Messiah, meaning the Israelite king who functions as the representative for all of his people, and we've also seen that Son of God is a reference for the nation of Israel as a whole, then we shouldn't be surprised that there's going to be Son of God as a title used both for the king and also for the people. And so we're going to see this in Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Now that we've been alerted to these clues that are already there in Matthew chapter 2, in Matthew chapter 3, and in Matthew chapter 4. And we're not even being exhaustive with all of the details. There's a lot more we could do with the temptation narrative. There's a lot more we can do with the baptism of Jesus. But I think we've put just enough evidence on the table that we can start to sense these connections and we can work with it. So in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, Jesus says, "Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth." Now, you might be hearing this and thinking, what does that have to do with sonship? Well, it has everything to do with sonship, because it is the work of a father figure to give an inheritance to his sons. When you're speaking of an inheritance, which is the noun, and of course the verb to inherit, which are semantically related, you are talking about a father passing on possessions to his sons. So if Jesus is saying that his followers, those who have accepted his message of the kingdom, who have repented and are now listening to his teachings, Jesus is saying that the ones that are gentle, they will have the earth as their inheritance, meaning they are going to function as sons receiving something that belongs to the Father. The inheritance is something that a father gives to the sons. So implicitly, Jesus is saying that you, my followers, are sons of God. But you got to be gentle first. There's a qualification. They're not just born sons of God. They have to fulfill these new covenant teachings. They have to be gentle. A few verses later, in chapter 5, verse 9, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. So there we have the future tense. They will be called sons of God if they function as doers and makers of peace. That's what the Greek actually means, to do or to make. They are doing peace or they're making peace. But notice again the qualification: if you act this way, then you will be recognized as sons of God. Now, some people might think that the Israelites were already sons of God. They were born into the covenant, and that's true. But there's another sense in which they become sons of God through obedience, through being faithful, which again is what we've already seen in Matthew chapter 4. Jesus demonstrates the validity of his title as Son of God because he's being faithful to God. He's being loyal. He's being an obedient son. He is living by every word that comes out of the mouth of Yahweh. And of course, if they are called sons of God, then God by definition is the Father. They are not sons of a triune God. They are sons of God who functions as the Father alone. Let's keep reading. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, Jesus openly declares that God is their Father, where he says, "Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." That's Matthew 5, verse 16. So again, the followers of Jesus, the disciples, they are bearing this title, Son of God, and God, of course, is their Father. We see this again towards the end of Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven." Again, notice, in order to be sons of your Father, you have to obey Jesus' teaching. You have to love your enemies. You have to pray for them. And in doing so, you bear the characteristics of your Father who is in heaven, the one that rains down on the righteous and the unrighteous. But they are sons of God. They bear that title, but the title's not automatic. It's not a given. It's not a participation trophy that's just given out to everybody. This is something that they get by being faithful and obedient to the terms of the covenant as Jesus is giving them. Let's look a little bit further in the Beatitudes. In verses 10 through 11 of chapter 5, there's an interesting parallel that I think people overlook as they're reading through these. So in Matthew 5, verse 10, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness." Remember that. For the sake of righteousness. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then he says in verse 11, "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." Notice what took place there. Jesus says in verse 10 that you're being persecuted. And in verse 11, he talks about various forms of persecution. But in verse 10, you're persecuted for the sake of righteousness. But in verse 11, you're persecuted for the sake, not of righteousness, but for the sake of me, of Jesus. And I think people are meant to read verses 10 and verses 11 in parallel. They are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, that is, the righteousness that is defined by Jesus himself. The standard of new covenant living and membership that allows people to become sons of God if they're obedient and faithful and loyal to the terms of this new covenant is actually defined by Jesus himself. Because in order to become sons of God, that sonship is mediated through the King, the mediator of the new covenant, who himself is, guess what? The royal Son of God. You see how this is all coming together? That's how it works. The followers of Jesus are sons of God. And I'm not meaning to leave out the women here, okay? I'm using this as kind of a general term. Children of God. They are children of God. God is their father. And they have this because they're being faithful and obedient to the things that Jesus said. But Jesus is just communicating the things that he received from God. And Jesus, of course, has demonstrated in the chapter earlier that he has the right to be the royal, kingly, messianic Christ, the Son of God, because he too is being faithful to the Father and obeying every word that comes out of the Father's mouth. Sonship in Matthew is not just a relationship to the Father as the only true God. Sonship implies obedience to the Father. And that applies to Jesus, who is faithful as a obedient son to the Father, and also to Jesus' followers who are sons of God as members of the new covenant. So Jesus mediates his sonship within the new covenant. And this is not something that Moses actually did in the Mosaic covenant. It's different because Moses doesn't have a unique title of Son of God that Jesus does. So the disciples are the ideal sons of God by obeying the commands of God that are spoken through Jesus, namely the messianic and royal Son of God. They both bear the title Son of God, and the Son of God is someone who is loyal, faithful, and obedient to God as their Father. So, we already alluded to Matthew chapter 6, verse 9 in the Lord's Prayer, where Jesus said, "Pray then in this way, Our Father," first person plural, "Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name." So here Jesus is saying "our," that first person plural pronoun, indicating that Jesus and his disciples are all sons because they all share the same Father. The God of Jesus is the same God of his disciples, namely the Father alone. This is clearly stated in John 20, verse 17, but this episode is about the Gospel of Matthew, so I'm going to stick to Matthew. Now, you can really make an argument, and I think it's fair, that Jesus is not a son of God in the same way that his disciples are sons of God, and that's true. Jesus is the Son of God as the Messianic King, and he mediates this sonship in the terms of the new covenant. Now, Jesus was born the Son of God. That much is true. I mean, God literally is his Father. I mean, God fathered Jesus with the creative power of God's Holy Spirit. But he was crowned Son of God as the Messiah, as the Christ, publicly in the coronation ceremony of his baptism. And all four Gospels begin this way to make the same point. The disciples, on the other hand, they receive their sonship when it's mediated through Jesus and by being faithful to the terms of the new covenant. They're being obedient to the things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount and the rest of the things among Jesus' own teachings and his commands. Later in Matthew, towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he says in chapter 7, verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter." That's Matthew 7, verse 21. So obedience is required, and that obedience is defined here as doing the will of Jesus' Father. You have to do that if you want to enter into the kingdom of heaven on that day. Now, what's interesting is that Jesus is saying this to his disciples, the children of God, and he says, you have to be obedient to the will of my Father. But guess what? Jesus himself, as the Son who represents his people, as the King, the Messiah who represents his people, he also demonstrated that he's going to be faithful to the will of his Father. So in the garden, this is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 26, verse 39. He was praying, and he said, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. So not my will, but your will be done. And then what's really interesting, and it's not so easy to see this in English, but it's very clear in the Greek. He says a couple verses later, in verse 42, in Matthew 26:42, my Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. Matthew 26, verse 42. Jesus said, your will be done. I mean, he is literally saying the thing that he has asked his disciples to pray in Matthew chapter 6, verse 9. Your kingdom come, your will be done. I think it's actually Matthew chapter 6, verse 10. But in Greek, it's actually the same. It's actually the same phrase. Yenithito to thelema su. It's actually there in Matthew chapter 6, verse 10, and it's also there in Matthew chapter 26, verse 42. Jesus is quoting the phrase from the Lord's Prayer, where he's telling his disciples to pray, may your will be done to the Father. And Jesus takes that, and he actually prays the very same thing in Matthew chapter 26, verse 42, because Jesus is the obedient Son, the one who, of course, is going to represent his people. Sonship in the Gospel of Matthew is not just that you have a unique relationship with the Father as the only true God. Sonship implies that you submit and that you're faithful and you're obedient to the Father as the only true God. And Jesus as the Son, as a human being, demonstrated his obedience to God. So, in conclusion, what are some of the things that we've seen in this week's episode? Well, number one, we've seen that Jesus is the anointed Son of God, the Messiah, who succeeds in the wilderness temptation where his Israelite ancestors had failed. Number two, in the midst of this temptation, Jesus quotes a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, in order to demonstrate that he himself, Jesus, is a human being, a man, a human being who faithfully obeys every single word that comes out of the mouth of Yahweh. He's an obedient human son. And that's the Christology of Matthew. Number three, Jesus summons his disciples and calls them to act in a way deserving of the title Son of God. This title implies one who is obedient to the covenant. And in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, these teachings are new covenant teachings. Number four, as the royal Son of God, Jesus mediates sonship to his followers when they obey his teachings. They become sons of God. Number five, Jesus' Father, Yahweh, is the very same Father that his disciples have. And number six, Matthew's Christology illustrates Jesus as the human Son of God, one person who teaches and believes that Yahweh is the Father alone. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we continue to explore the Gospel of Matthew, looking at the theme of sonship and the way in which Jesus exemplifies that as the royal messianic Son of God, and how he summons his followers to also be obedient sons of God. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the non-negotiable truths of the oneness of God and the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by liking and subscribing and sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. But if you want to throw us a few dollars, you can check out the episode's description for a PayPal link, or you can subscribe to one of two membership options on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.